In this video, we're going to record a short demo of using the new personal information test element and the Dataset Anonymity test element. So I'm logged into the Luminos AI platform here, and I've loaded up a submission, so an instance of one of our test forms. And this is just a simple demo form, so as if I were a user requesting approval of a dataset for sharing. So I can provide some basic information about my data set, including whether, of course, I want to assert that I don't have any sensitive personal data in this data set, but just asserting it may not be sufficient. We'd also like to actually inspect the data set and test it. So I'm going to run first our personal information test. What I'll do that is simply by uploading a CSV file with some of our sample or a full set of our data. So here you can see our CSV file has some names and zip codes, which is probably no good for personal information testing, and then some other information which is probably harder to trace back to a unique individual. So I'll call this payroll 1. I'll go ahead and run this test. And you will see that we will quickly get a failed test result back. So what just happened in the background there was this full data set, not just the preview, but the whole data set was sent to our proprietary data science library and evaluated for a number of different factors. And we found a number of columns that look like they're a concern for our personal information. So we would not want to be sharing this data set externally. I'm going to try to run a new test at a data set that I have cleaned up a little better than that. So let's try this one here. I'll call this payroll 2. And you can see in this one, we've got pay group, bonus eligibility, retirement eligibility. None of these could be tracked back to an individual human being or be close personal attributes. So if I run this test, then we will get a passing result. So that's good. It's important to note here, this testing can be run by dragging and dropping test files through the UI, but you also have access through our API to call this directly from your data science library if you're so inclined. You can also go back and look at the run history and inspect the specific results that you had and see which columns were detected. This is the kind of information that gets returned by the API tester. So now that we've got a data set that we're happy with for personal information, we also want to check dataset anonymity, which is to say we want the individual rows in the data set to be non-unique, so that you couldn't, if you knew somebody was in a data set, you couldn't go back and identify that specific person and what row is in there and maybe expose some other information. So we are going to upload a different file for this. This is dataset 3. So we've got some of the similar fields that we've seen before, including the gender one. We'll call this payroll 3. And when I click on this one, it's a slightly more complex setup with 1 or 2 parameters to set. So if we're going to check for anonymity, we have to do 2 things. We have to select which fields we think might be quasi-identifiers that could be triangulated with another data set. Internal data fields that may not have any real meaning to them, we can probably safely ignore those. But we're going to go ahead and examine these 4. So for any combinations of these, how unique are the rows in this data set? And we're going to use a k-value of 5, meaning we want to have at least 5 instances of every possible combination of values in our data set from these quasi-identifier fields. So we're making sure that somebody that knows some of this information couldn't come to this data set and identify an individual in it. But we set a k-value, we exclude the fields that we think are not quasi-identifiers, and we go ahead and run the test. Same thing, this will be passed to our data science library, and we'll come back very quickly. This one's actually a really good result. So we have a max k of exactly 5 with no data loss. So this data set would be safe to share. We could share, for example, I'll show you what it looks like if we have a different data set. So here's another version of this that has, instead of the retirement eligible, we've got some smaller age brackets, and so these rows are more unique. And if we run this test, what we will find with these 4 fields with a k equals 5, if we run this test, what we find is that actually this one is not safe to share. There are actually unique rows in here. So our max k is 1, so testing across these 4 groups. If you wanted to get to a k-value of 5, we would need to throw away 20% of our rows, and that would represent 53% of our unique combinations of values. And so this data set may be significantly reduced in value if it's shared in this form, but it's also not appropriate to share because of the dataset anonymity concerns. So we would suggest to the data scientist to further generalize one of these columns, probably the age column, because that's the smallest buckets. That's an example of running anonymity tests and personal information tests in our environment. And then based on those results, you can, in our platform, of course, build automations. So for example, when I submit this for review, when I get to the next step of this form, because we have a failed test result, we're going to recommend a consultation with our data science team or with our legal governance team, and we can launch another submission to take care of that. If we get a data set that comes in here and passes both of these clean, this document can be automatically approved, and the submitter can move on to data sharing without having to take any extra time from the responsible AI team.